So I must confess that I find myself these days with a lot of internal stirrings of unrest. Maybe you feel the same. Sometimes it's harder than others, but perhaps it's how I'm wired. We're all wired a little bit differently on the scale of developmental psychology, and you can probably pin me after I say what I'm going to say next. Even in the best of times, I find myself on the inside, no matter how I present on the outside. Even in the best of times, I find myself living in sort of the shadowlands of the monotone and melancholy. And in the worst of times, well, it's hard not to teeter on the edge of discouragement and despair. For me, and I speak only for myself, but maybe you will resonate as well. For me, mountaintop experiences are elusive and rare. And I just need to add, doom scrolling through social media and news feeds doesn't help. I heard that, amen. I mean, just think about it for a moment. We spend a lot of time there for whatever reason. We live in a time when it's easy for even the most, you know some of these folk, and some of them are you, because I know you. So even some of the most perky and positive and buoyant personalities can succumb to discouragement. And in these days, depending on where one is with political persuasions, the data are clear that many people are giving up on religion, including Christianity, altogether. If indeed as it seems, that it's professing followers of Jesus who are most supportive of the crashing waves of today's national and international headlines. I mean, if that's the thing, then why bother? Crashing waves. We just got back from Hawaii. I've got to get positive here. And it was a wonderful time. But part of that trip in Oahu was to go around the coastline and spend most of the time seeing the water. And at the North Shore, where the so-called pipeline is, where we watch people surfing. I didn't. I wanted to, but I didn't. I was afraid of this old body. But the people there at the pipeline weren't the ones who were just catching these little waves at the regular beaches. These were the big waves coming in, and even those waves were sort of segregated by the biggest over here, where apparently with the way the waves break in that pipeline shore, and the lesser big waves, bigger than I'd want to do, over here, and people sort of segregated themselves into the areas that they could handle. And they would swim into those waves, and they would come crashing, and they would be exuberant and buoyant and exhilarating. But it has nothing to do with what I want to illustrate. But the waves do. The waves do. Sometimes it feels like the press of what we see in the news is just overwhelming. It's almost as though it's stirred up in order to make waves. And they keep coming. And sometimes you feel like you might go under. But this is the time for a sermon. This is the time for not a review of the world news. This is the time, the place for a message from God. It's not a time for wallowing in the ever-tossing currents of culture. And friends, the word today for you and for me is a word of hope. We need a word of hope. It's a word of hope, a word of encouragement in the midst of the whims of political leaders, no matter where you land on the political spectrum, in the midst of the whims of worldly politics. In the midst of boisterous bullying in our world today, there's a word of hope. I mean, after all, today is Transfiguration Sunday. Today is the very day, it's the climactic conclusion of this short season of ordinary time after the Epiphany, a day that is particularly on the calendar meant to bolster us for the rigors and sobriety of the Lenten journey that begins this week. Wednesday, by the way, 7 and 7. Ash Wednesday. In the face of today's world news and national news, and in the face of my own internal stirrings, I'm especially taken by Paul's word of declaration in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1. Listen to it again. Therefore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. We do not lose heart. Hear that? It's pretty easy to lose heart right now. It's pretty easy to throw in the towel. But Paul says, in the midst of turbulent times, we need not lose heart. And so this morning, I want to just briefly echo some enduring practices for turbulent times, one from each of these passages. They're basic, they're simple. You're going to say, oh yes, of course. But then I hope the Spirit says, but am I practicing these basic things? Enduring practices for turbulent times such as these. First of all, from the gospel. That gospel passage is so very clear, and it's this: keep your focus on Jesus. Pretty basic, isn't it? Keep your focus on Jesus. We've learned that if you grew up in church from the very earliest days, right? Keep your focus on Jesus, and yet it seems harder and harder and harder for that to actually happen in our lives. Keep your focus on Jesus. Perhaps you've noticed that this brief season of ordinary time, this green season, is punctuated by white days. That is, with the Epiphany itself and the baptism of the Lord and Transfiguration. Those days where in the ordinary part of ordinary time we see the ministry of Jesus and see how that begins to unfold. But on those days, those special days, the focus is not on the ministry of Jesus so much as it is on the person and work of Jesus. It's about who he is and what he did. Baptism of the Lord, who he is, the epiphany of the Lord, what he came to reveal. And now today, on Transfiguration Sunday, we see it again, where our attention is squarely focused on the person of Christ. It's the church calendar's rhythmic, poetic reminder that the focus of our lives must always be on the person and work and exemplary model of Jesus for how we ought to live in our lives. That everything in this passage's focus is on Christ. Let me read it one more time. Now, about 8 days after these things, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This one is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. It's unmistakable. You can't miss it. This passage, like the baptism passages and like the Epiphany passages, are all about who Christ is. Keep your focus on Jesus. Why? I mean, I think we get the point, but what's the reason? The reason is that, as Jesus from this point on in the gospel begins to move toward the cross, it is dangerous, like it is for us in the difficult times of life. It's dangerous in times of turbulence and suffering and uncertainty and the unknown to get distracted. And yet it's so easy. It's dangerous to take our eyes off of Jesus, to take our ears from listening to Jesus. The first enduring practice is to keep your focus on Jesus. The second flows right out of it. It's equally basic and simple. But this one comes from the Exodus passage and the story of Moses. And it's this: like Moses, spend time with God. Don't be offended. It may seem elementary, and it is. Spend time with God. And the reason I say don't be offended is because maybe we need to stop and think about that question. Consider how much time we are being bombarded with the turbulence of the news, bombarded with the turbulence of the day. I mean, you see it all around you all the time. We participate in it, at least I do. But when you're traveling, you sort of see it sort of in an exaggerated way because you're in airports and you're on airplanes and you're in places where you're waiting and you don't know anybody, and everybody to a person is doing this. Everybody. Everybody. Hardly anyone is not. And I don't know what they're reading. I can't see that far away. Maybe they're reading the Bible. Maybe not. More likely, they're scrolling through the news or social media or something that is feeding them with all of the turbulence of the day and stirring up stuff. And depending on where you are on that psychological spectrum of how you're wired, it impacts you in a certain way. Shouldn't our immersion in time with God be at least maybe equal? Ideally more than that? Notice the commitment of Moses. It seems to have been a regular rhythm of his life. What we surely know is that this was something he did on a regular basis, and at least 2 times the Bible tells us he spent almost 6 weeks, 40 days and 40 nights in extended periods with God. And notice also that he was in a time when there was a stubborn, rebellious people. It was a time of cultural idolatry, of putting the guise of religion on idols. And the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. It struck me that maybe the first time in my memory, it was a dermatologist who was reading that passage. Beth, I had to wonder what, Dr. Francis, maybe later you can tell us what you think about this, but not right now. It's clear that she does skin, I don't know what she does, but she does skin. It struck me as kind of comical. But whatever it was, the skin of his face shone. so that whether it was the people needed to be protected because you can't see God and live, or it was too bright, we don't really know. But we know that something happened that made Moses different, that made him different. And it's not so much how it happened or what it was, but what's important is to see the fruit of his time with God. The fruit of his time with God was a radiance. It was a radiance that came directly from intimacy with God. You've met some of those people, haven't you? Did you just sort of know in the first words out of their mouth or the glance in their eye that they are a person who spends time with God? There's a radiance that comes from intimacy with God. But it's not just that. For Moses, there was a substance that came from listening to and communing with God. I mean, he came down the mountain with the Decalogue. He came down the mountain with the word of the Lord because he had communed with God. It says he spent time talking with God. Substance comes in our own lives personally, but in our communication with others. Substance comes from communing with and talking with God. And then it's not only radiance and substance, but notice there's also in Moses a humility. He didn't even know his face was shining. When you go read the rest of the passage, he didn't realize that it was they told him and he had to cover up. He wasn't aware that he was different. It was a humility that came from dependence upon God. And I don't know about you, but when I'm doom scrolling through social media and the news feed, I see hardly any radiance. And I see hardly any substance. And I see virtually no humility. And it all comes from spending time with God. It's the only way it comes. I want to be like Moses. What am I doing that increases my intimacy with God? My listening to God's voice? My dependence on God rather than dependence on my knowledge or my understanding? And then finally, not only do we need to keep our focus on Jesus and spend time with God, we need to follow the declaration of the Apostle Paul to not lose heart. Do not lose heart. No matter what happens, no matter what's going on in the world, because turbulent times will come and they go. We've been here before, we'll be there again, here again. And Paul so beautifully lays out a picture that in essence mirrors what happened to Moses can happen to us as followers of Jesus. Because of Christ, the radiance that Moses embodied on behalf of the Hebrew people is now the glorious privilege of the followers of Jesus. That's extraordinary. The radiance that Moses embodied is now the privilege of Jesus' disciples, you and me. It's now we who have the opportunity to bear the radiant presence of God in our world. Listen to Paul, how he goes on and talks about this. When one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed, and all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, We ourselves are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory into another. I see the radiance of Jesus in your faces, but it's going to be shinier next week if you live and love Jesus and spend time with God. Because that's who you are. Because of Christ, we are immersed in the words of Christ, and we have, therefore, substance to share and nothing to hide. We can live a transparent life and something deeply meaningful to share. And Paul says here, we have renounced shameful things. We refuse to practice cunning or to falsify God's word. We openly speak the truth and commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Substance. And because of Christ, we walk in humility and serve others as Jesus did. Paul goes on in just past the passage that we read in 2 Corinthians, and he says in verse 5 and verse 7, we do not proclaim ourselves. We do not proclaim ourselves. We are nothing. But we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and ourselves as slaves for Jesus' sake. And he goes on and he says, we have this treasure in clay jars. That we are broken, frail human beings. And yet in those clay vessels, humble vessels, God is able to radiate the presence of Jesus in the world. Dear friends, this is the time to shine. In turbulent times when it feels most hopeless, this is the time to shine. Turbulent times in which we live have happened before, and as I said, they will happen again. I was reading this week Russell Moore's blog. He calls it More to the Point. And he reminded me of Paul's words to his son in the faith, to Timothy. And Paul wrote to Timothy that evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. And then he told that younger pastor to fight all of that and to conserve the gospel in the face of anyone who would empty it out. And then the Apostle Paul goes on to say in verse 14 of 2 Timothy 3, but as for you in the face of those kinds of things, continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you have learned it and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. But as for you, your anchor holds behind the veil. Weep, yes. Grieve, yes. Be angered. Work for reform. But don't get cynical. Don't get demoralized. Do not give up, because the gospel is real. The stories are true. Christ is risen. Jesus saves. Things happen in our world that God is doing, and we are called to radiate the goodness and grace and love and mercy of God as modeled by Jesus. To care for the poor, the downtrodden, and the marginalized and the oppressed. To heal the sick, to feed the hungry, to weep with those who weep, and mourn with those who mourn, to love our enemies, and to notice and declare God's work in the world. You know, I think in the last 8 or 10 days, I have witnessed 2 miracles. I mean, there's probably been a bunch more, but I haven't noticed them. I usually don't notice them. I don't mean to put Dan on the spot, but Dan's stroke a little over a week ago He's here today. He's going to be a Eucharistic minister this morning. The doctors say that he can't be doing this well already. And he could have been dead. 50 to 60% of people who have the same kind of stroke are. There are miracles today. Our youngest daughter, who's a school counselor, is assigned to work with the most needy kids in their school. And she sent us a little video of a young man that she works with. And this little boy, I don't know how old he is, age, but he's young. He's nonverbal. And his normative way of expressing is to kick and scream and yell. That's it. And she shared in this video pictures of this little guy with a therapy dog tossing the ball back and forth and laughing and having a great time and bringing the ball back. The dog brought the ball back and he'd throw it again and he just had a great time. It was a little short video. And then Becca said, which wasn't on the video, she said, and when it was over, this little kid went to his talking machine, and I don't even know what that is, but he's got a talking machine that he has to go to try to speak. And he said, thank you. That's a miracle. That's because human touch and the goodness of God in the world is still doing stuff in the midst of the difficulties of our lives. And friends, we're called to shine no matter what. May God help us. Amen.